2022 was one of the worst for South Africans as far as electricity is concerned. Eskom implemented different stages of load shedding throughout the year, a move that angered many and left some small businesses in the cold. With no sign of an end to the rolling blackouts, should South Africans brace themselves for a permanent stage 4 load shedding this year? Energy expert David Lipsig joins us for more on this. David, good evening and thank you so much for joining us.
Good evening. Good to be with you again.
David, first question would be, are we likely going to see the end of load shedding in the near future?
Highly unlikely. We're in it for the long haul, and there's so many problems that it's definitely going to continue for the foreseeable future, which is probably years rather than months.
And
at what stage it's going to be, I can't tell, but it's definitely going to be carrying on.
What would be the cause of that? I mean, we've had many reasons. Every time there's load shedding, we are told of wet coal, we are told of this and that. Eskom has been giving us different reasons to why we have the stages that are interchanging, breakouts here and there. But what exactly is the reason why we can't find a solution to this problem?
There are a few reasons. One problem is that the new coal power stations are called supercritical power stations, and they require the best quality coal, and we're not giving them the best quality coal. So, next to Medupi is a power station called Matimba, which gets its coal from Grootegeluk, and both these power stations get their coal from the same place, and the issue is that the engineers in the old South Africa worked out how to take poor quality coal with a very high ash content, very abrasive, and they spent about 10 or 12 years working out how to use the poor quality coal locally. It meant lower temperatures, it meant special kinds of blowers, it meant special kinds of conveyor belts, and when the new power stations were designed, they didn't take account of the learning. So the first reason is inputs. The second reason is scientifically, there was a guy called Amory Lovins, and in about 2008, he wrote a paper which the government knew about because they told people like me about it in November 2008 in a meeting in Parliament. And Amory Lovins, a person with 40, 50 years of energy experience in America, said there are no economies of scale in a coal power station above 800 megawatts. And for me, that meant that we shouldn't be building 2 monster power stations. We should be building 10 or maybe even 20 smaller power stations. So that's another problem. The next problem is that when Eskom started the build of these supercritical power stations, they were told that they needed to have very experienced welders, and they were going to use, I think, Toshiba, or one of those Japanese companies, were going to supply the welders. And after 6 months, Eskom said, train the local people to do the welding, and that was a huge mistake for that to happen, because Eskom said we need to localize build, but there's a discrepancy in my mind, and I've been speaking about it for a long time. What are the power stations for? Are the power stations for the 10,000 people who are building the power station, or are they for the 2 million people who are going to depend on the electricity from the power station? For me, the 2 million people who are going to get electricity and jobs because of the power station are much more important than the 10,000 people who are going to be employed in the power station, although obviously both groups of people are important. A coal power station, a single unit of a coal power station, shouldn't take more than 2 to 5 years to build. We've had these things being built from 2008 till 2022, and you can tell as well as I can that that's a lot longer than 5 years. So we have all of these things happening at the same time, and we need to identify, what are the causes and deal with these causes and fix the problem and not keep going from bad to worse.
Let's bring in the issue of politics, if I may. How much of a role does that play, David, politics? I mean, we've had President Cyril Ramaphosa, long before he was president, talking about, no, this thing will be a thing of the past. Lo and behold, we are seeing the worst stages. How much of a role does politics play in this regard?
You know, the shareholder is the government, but the government is owned by the people, and the people should be in control, but the people aren't in control. So there's a political mismatch in terms of the people who are controlling the country and the people that are fixing the country. So there's that issue. What understanding, you know, are people taking the time to read Eskom's accounts? Are they taking time to say, what are the issues? You know, is Parliament taking responsibility for its responsibility on behalf of the people? Are the right people employed in Parliament to be able to have oversight on Eskom's management? And the same goes for the other state-owned enterprises. I think that politically, you know, maybe South Africa was in too much of a rush to move from, you know, white control to black control. I don't know, but we're 30 years later, and you know, it was obvious that we needed to have a major amount of mentoring happening and a major amount of transfer in knowledge. I mean, one of the things that I say with my business is that I work to make myself redundant. And I know it's a paradox, but the more I do this, the more work I get as I give my clients more and more capability to do the kinds of things that I can do. And my belief is that, you know, the old regime should have, I think that it was Korea or something, where the new president of Korea or Vietnam said that the day the Americans leave is the day we call them back to help us build our economy. You know, one of the things that Madiba said is we need to forgive the past. We can't fix the past. What we can do is we can fix the future. And what we need to do is we need to make use of all the people like myself and hundreds of active citizens, active scientists doing their own research and development, learning how things work, studying policy, and working together with the new South Africans. I mean, the white population is decreasing very quickly. The black population is increasing very quickly, as it should be. You know, so there's that kind of political issue which we all find very difficult to speak about, but which we really need to speak about.
David,
so politically...
Yeah, if I may, I mean, you said earlier on that, you know, we were very quick to move to the black control. Are you saying that, you know, if we were still in some sort of a white rule, would things be better in terms of how they handled Eskom and the power issue?
No, I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is that we obviously needed the regime, you know, the old apartheid regime, as they called, to change to a democratic regime, to a democracy. We obviously needed that. At the same time as that, we needed to say that the new politicians who didn't have the experience to run the country should have appointed managers to manage the transition. And an energy transition is not something that happens overnight. It's something that happens, you know, in the IT world, in the computer world, the short term is 6 months, the medium term is a year, the long term is 2 years. In the energy world, electricity, big power stations, the short term is 5 years, the medium term is 15 years, the long term is 50 years. So, you know, that whole transition of energy needed to be managed better. You know, South Africa, the South African democracy is now about 32 years old, from the time that the change really started happening in 1990. So I think we need to now be adults. We've been through the childish stage. We've been through the stage of, you know, being a teenager and rebelling. Now we're adults. We're 30-year-old adults. We need to act like adults. We need to say, as adults, how do we work with each other? How do the experienced people work with the inexperienced people? How do the former engineers work with the current engineers? And it's not just a white-black thing. There are lots of black people who are very experienced and very competent and very capable who must be transferring their knowledge to the next generation as well. So there's some kind of mismatch going on, and it's not just happening in South Africa. You can see it happening in Europe, in America, in other parts of the world. You know, I'm not a sociologist, but I see that there's a big mismatch in experience compared to, you know, youth, and we need to find a way to mesh the two together. And I think that if we do that, we'll solve our problems.
So the other thing is the issue of the finances. I mean, if you look at the Eskom and the money that it's spending on electricity, on coal, it is quite exorbitant at this point. And also, they've gone to a point where they would always ask for more money and also keep on raising, the money, go to the National Electricity Regulator of South Africa and say that, can we get more money? Can we get more to this? And they get that. I mean, is it really a fact that Eskom does not have money? And if so, how do we solve that issue of lack of finances at Eskom, if there is such a problem?
Well, I mean, I've got the Eskom accounts at the bottom of my screen. And it says here, although the headline says 12 billion rand loss, which is half of the 25 billion rand loss from last year, which seems terrible, one needs to understand that in the context of, it says improvement of 19.8 billion in EBITDA, which is profit before tax and interest and so on, and debt. An improvement of 61% due to higher revenue and cost control. Operating profit increased 238% from 6 billion to 20 billion. Net loss reduced from 25 billion to 12 billion. Improved cash from operations from 31 billion to 53 billion. And then it says, but still not sufficient to cover debt servicing costs. Now, if you start a textile factory, it takes 10 years to make a profit. But you still have positive cash flow because you understand that when you finance your textile machines, they take 10 years to break even. The same thing happens with a coal power station, which is going to last 40 years, and it's going to take 25 years to break even. In other words, a new coal power station of the size of Medupi, Kusile, and so on, is going to take 25 years to break even. And that's with the cost of electricity going up with inflation every year. Now, in my understanding, I've got an MBA, I've studied finance, I've studied accounting. I wouldn't say I'm the world's experts at that. Eskom employ the experts. We need to ask them, why is there a mismatch between the short-term accounting and the long-term accounting? Why is Eskom trying to find a way to massively finance the new power stations so they make a profit in the first year they go live or the 10th year, when we know for a fact that the coal power station is going to make a loss of 25 years, but in the last 15 years, it's going to make such high profits that those profits are going to wipe out the losses in 5 or 6 years, and then there's something called super profits that happened in the last 8 to 10 years of that 40-year period. And then we know that the power station life can be improved. So the way I look at it is that there's a financing mismatch between the running cost and the ability of Eskom to run itself, and then of looking separately at the costing and so on of Medupi and Kusile. Of course, there are the problems that Medupi and Kusile have cost 3 or 4 times more than they should have cost. They've taken longer to build, and I've done the spreadsheet where I've done it's called a project analysis, where you take a baseline and you take the actual, and the difference in revenue from a GDP point of view is 50 trillion rand. That's 50 billion rand, and that equates to about 10 billion rand a day of lost GDP for the country, plus VAT and all the other things. So the fact that those power stations are not running as they're meant to is costing the economy at least 10 billion rand a day before load shedding. So to get back to your question about, Eskom is making a loss. Yes, it's making a loss after debt costs. But in my opinion, that's okay from a long-term project finance point of view, as opposed to the fact that Eskom is making a massive profit on its electricity sales. And even with load shedding, its electricity sales went up last year for the first time in many years.
Right.
So,
David, just 2 more points before we wrap up this conversation. Let's talk about the issue of leadership. There's been a lot of question about whether Andre de Ruyter is or was the right person for the job, whether things were better under Matsela Koko. How important is the issue of leadership or the right person at the helm of Eskom?
If you go back to the 1990s, I think from 1994 till 2008, I think there were 2 or 3 CEOs of Eskom. And that's about right. I mean, a CEO should be a CEO for 10 years. You know, since 2008, when President Zuma came to power, we've had pretty much a CEO every year. And that's a recipe for disaster. You know, there's no, when I spoke to you about the medium term and the long term, 15 years, 50 years, you really need a CEO in a big company, a conglomerate like Eskom, to be the CEO for 15 years to really see a difference. And that CEO must be given the responsibility of the CEO. Machiavelli, I think in the 17th century, you can check, said that responsibility without authority is a recipe for disaster. Andre de Ruyter gets given, and the predecessors get given responsibility, but without the authority to manage and control their risks, their inputs, their supply chains, to be able to hire and fire the kinds of people that they need for the long term. So I hope that gives some kind of idea that, you know, if you take any of the really big companies in the world, typically you have a CEO for 10, 15 years, and then the CEO becomes the chairman, and the chairman's responsibility is to find new customers, play golf, do those kinds of things, entertain, and bring people in for the CEO to do their job.
David, unfortunately, we're out of time, but thank you so much for coming through to talk to us and sharing with us your insight.